Good afternoon. My name is Rory. I'm a second-year law student at Berkeley and a law clerk at GC3. I'm going to teach you a little about nonprofit organizations and what you should consider if you're deciding whether to form your venture as a nonprofit versus a co-op. My presentation won't cover all the details of forming a nonprofit and seeking tax exemption. It will just be an introduction. So if you are seriously considering starting a nonprofit organization, you should definitely talk to an attorney about all the ins and outs. You're probably thinking, this is a workshop about worker co-ops. Why is he talking about nonprofit organizations? We at GC3 understand that many of you are interested in the co-op model precisely because you do not want to be a nonprofit. But some of you may be considering both entity types, and a common question we get is whether it's possible to form a worker co-op as a nonprofit. In some ways, the ideals of nonprofits and co-ops overlap. Both care about more than their bottom line, seek to empower people, and usually start as grassroots organizations. But as I'm going to explain, there are several significant differences between the two types of entities. But before I start, let's take a step back and talk about what a nonprofit organization is. What comes to mind when you hear the term nonprofit?
Community service.
Community service?
No money.
No money.
Grant independent.
All right. So as a legal definition of a nonprofit organization, we focus on three things. First, a nonprofit organization is, in fact, a corporation. In California, most are organized as a public benefit corporation. That's the name that the law uses. So if you're doing research about this, or you're trying to get documents that you need to file with the state, that's what you should look for, public benefit corporation. The second part of the definition, a nonprofit may be tax exempt, but not necessarily, because tax exemption is a separate step from forming a nonprofit entity in California, the public benefit corporation. At the federal level, tax exemption is handled by the IRS. The most common federal tax exemption for nonprofits is known as the 501c3 exemption. State tax exemption is yet another separate step, but it generally follows the federal exemption. So deal with the IRS first and then go to the state. Finally, the third part of the basic definition of a nonprofit is that a nonprofit is organized and operated exclusively for a charitable purpose. This, in fact, relates to the tax exemption. The 501c3 exemption requires an organization to be organized and operated exclusively for a limited set of purposes, namely ones that the IRS considers charitable, educational, scientific, or religious. Here are a few examples of nonprofit organizations that you may have heard of. Habitat for Humanity, the Sierra Club, Mills College, East Bay Community Law Center, San Francisco Symphony, and even the Mozilla Foundation, which is the force behind Firefox. So what about your organization? Could your venture be a nonprofit? Some ideas could work as either a nonprofit or a co-op. For example, let's imagine that Green Commonwealth, the landscaping co-op that we've created in our skit, decided to branch out from landscaping services. It decided to create an urban farm and attached cafe. The purpose would be to provide access to an education about healthy food for people living in food deserts in West Oakland. You could imagine this business as either a co-op or a nonprofit. If it were a worker co-op, it would operate the farm and cafe as a business, and the workers would own that business. If it were a nonprofit, it would focus on serving a charitable and educational purpose. Here, people living in the areas of West Oakland without access to fresh, healthy food would likely qualify as a charitable class in the IRS's mind that a nonprofit could seek to help. And teaching people about healthy eating would be an educational purpose. So how would the founders of Green Commonwealth decide whether to form this new venture as a co-op or a nonprofit organization? Well, next I'm going to introduce you to 4 important factors that you and they should consider. So, quick overview. The 4 factors are purpose, control, funding, and profits. The first and most important consideration is purpose. What will your organization do? Who will benefit from it? These are important questions because once you answer them, then you can begin thinking about whether you can articulate an exempt purpose that the IRS would recognize. So, thinking about Commonwealth's decision to form as a nonprofit, they're excited about the possibilities. They'll be able to get donations and grants and be exempt from taxes. But being a 501c3 tax-exempt nonprofit comes with certain limitations, specifically on the kinds of activities you can do and the overall purpose or mission of your business. Here's the bottom line. If Green Commonwealth is producing food, its primary motivation must be to further charitable and educational purposes. And its purposes must not be personal or commercial. There's an example of this type of charitable or nonprofit food enterprise right here in Oakland. City Slicker Farms, which operates farm stands and community farms that empower West Oakland community members to meet the immediate and basic need for healthy organic food for themselves and their families. Has anyone here heard of City Slicker Farms? Awesome. Because there is a lack of access to healthy foods in West Oakland, and the residents that City Slicker serves are considered economically disadvantaged by the IRS, City Slicker's activities are charitable and educational, and thus fit into what the IRS considers to be allowable activities for a 501c3 exempt organization. This is a clear example of a properly organized 501c3. But there can be some gray areas when it comes to food production like this. So let's take another look at the 3 distinct purposes of food production. Food we produce for personal consumption, food we produce as a commercial enterprise, and food we produce for charitable or educational purposes. As you can see in this visual, there is some potential for overlaps, which could be problematic and could affect your ability to qualify for the 501c3 exemption. What if you were going to grow a lot of food and give it to the handful of volunteers who grew it, and those volunteers didn't happen to be considered disadvantaged people? The problem with this is that a 501c3 is meant to benefit the public and communities in need, and can't be designed to benefit only a small private group of people. If, on the other hand, the communities who are working on this garden are disadvantaged, and you state to the IRS that your purpose is to help these specific communities grow and eat healthy food, then this could be a legitimate activity for your 501c3, because it would meet the IRS's definition of a charitable purpose. Now, what if you grow a lot of food and also want to sell it to earn money for your organization? That starts to look sort of like a typical commercial business, which creeps into a gray area between commercial and charitable activities. And the IRS is going to want to limit how much of this you can do, and might also want to tax you on the profits from that commercial activity. And finally, what if you have a project model that does all 3? Serves your personal needs, has a commercial component, and serves a larger charitable and educational purpose. Though in many ways this looks like a great business model, it remains problematic when it comes to the 501c3 tax exemption. One solution may be to reconsider other business structures, such as the for-profit structures that Jane just introduced you to. Co-ops in particular will often be able to serve all 3 of these circles: personal, commercial, and charitable. However, there will definitely be some times where being a nonprofit with that clear charitable purpose is the best option. All right, so the second factor to consider when choosing between a co-op, not all of them are that long, is control. One of the co-op principles that Sushil mentioned is democratic control by the workers. This is difficult to achieve in a nonprofit organization because the law actually limits the control that interested persons, defined as basically anyone who receives wages or salary from the organization for the work that they do for the organization, those interested persons cannot control more than 49% of board seats. Thus, unlike a worker co-op, where the workers could entirely control the board, in a nonprofit organization, you're going to need to bring in independent board members who are not being paid for the work that they're doing every day for the organization. Third factor, funding. Co-ops, as for-profit businesses, can have investors who acquire an interest, for instance, in the future returns of the organization. Nonprofits, on the other hand, have donors who make contributions or grants to the organization. And if the organization has that 501c3 tax exemption, those donors can claim a deduction on their taxes. Now, some ventures are going to be more appealing to donors, and other ventures are going to be more appealing to investors. So you'll want to think about what the likely sources of funding for your venture are going to be, and whether you'd rather be working with investors or courting donors. And finally, the fourth factor to consider is the profits that your venture is hopefully going to generate. Co-ops can distribute their profits to their members, but nonprofits cannot. Nonprofits can pay their workers reasonable wages, but any additional profits need to be reinvested in the organization's exempt purpose. So review. What are the four main factors that you're going to consider if you're on the fence between a co-op form and a nonprofit form? What's the first one? Purpose. Next? Control. Thank you, Janet. Third? Funding. And fourth? Profits. Great. So here's the bottom line. A co-op is a for-profit business that benefits its members, the worker owners. A nonprofit organization is one that is dedicated to serving the community at large. Stretch break. See you in 5 minutes. Thanks.